Well, with the number of the coronavirus cases increasing every day, people with the disease or that may have been exposed to the disease are in quarantine. But what are your legal rights when it comes to that? Can the government really quarantine somebody against their will? All of this is coming on the heels of some outrage out in Missouri. A father of the state's first coronavirus patient broke a quarantine his family was under to take one of his daughters to a school dance. Well, officials say they were trusting them to stay inside based on common sense and goodwill toward the community. That didn't work out. So joining us now with more, legal analyst Whitney Boan. Whitney, always good to have you here.
Good morning.
Good to see you.
Bob.
Talk to me about self-quarantining. Is that a real thing? Can they ask you to stay inside, and what if you don't?
They can ask you to stay inside for sure. And what people need to understand is there's a very common sense distinction here. Self-quarantine is something where you're asked to do it potentially or suggested that you do it, and that's different than a mandatory quarantine. Obviously, as you just discussed with the Missouri officials' comments regarding the father who took his daughter to the dance despite being advised and asked to self-quarantine, it would be common sense to go ahead and follow what the state or federal health authorities are asking you to do if they are asking you to quarantine yourself. But there's a distinction in terms of whether or not there's a court order for you to be quarantined, and that's a whole separate procedure, and that the consequences of that can even result in somebody going to jail if they don't follow through.
Isn't there an analogy to be made that here in Florida we have sort of a similar thing? If we have a hurricane and they have a mandatory evacuation, they want you to get out of those areas because otherwise you're putting the people who would have to rescue you at risk. Is that analogous to asking someone to stay inside because if they don't, they're putting people at risk?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think that there's a slight distinction here where we may start seeing the state of Florida Department of Health starting to go to courts, circuit courts with our state to seek injunctions to have people stay in as a mandatory quarantine. What you're discussing, of course, is what we would hope people would do, where it's just common sense. Don't put everybody else at risk. You know, just because you're around someone who you think might not be the target group, that is an elderly person, let's say, or a weakened immune system, doesn't mean that you're not putting somebody who's in their family at risk by being in contact with them. So you need to follow what our state and federal health officials are recommending at this point.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying. It's like there needs to be some sort of a pronouncement, like if the feds declared martial law, that means you can't leave your house. Well, they've made the announcement, and so new rules are in place. Is that what we're talking about, that they need an injunction, they need a court order to say that specific person can't leave their house?
Well, we're already in a state of public health state of emergency. That's been declared at a federal level, and I believe at our state level as well. But if it hasn't been, it will be shortly, I'm sure. But the response from that point forward is a little bit different, because I think it's going to be approached more, at this point at least, despite whether or not we have any further developments, which hopefully we don't, that make this worse, on a case-by-case basis. I would expect to see state health officials potentially going to circuit courts, seeking injunctions through the power of the court to put people under mandatory quarantines. But what that is different than what somebody's being asked to do in terms of self-quarantining. It doesn't mean that if you're asked to self-quarantine and then you don't do it, that then there might not be potential consequences in terms of state health officials then going to seek intervention from the court, or seeking even warrant power through the courts to potentially charge someone with a second-degree misdemeanor in Florida for violating the quarantine.
That's what I wanted to find out, and I'm out of time here, but what happens if you violate it? It's a second-degree misdemeanor.
It's a second-degree misdemeanor, up to 60 days jail, up to 6 months probation, up to a $500 fine.
Okay, you know, that's something you don't want to violate, then.
Exactly.
All right, Whitney Boan, thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate it.
Good to see you.
All right, let's check in.